Hello everyone, and welcome to my CBS BNB Full Today channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The atmosphere in Los Angeles had lately shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways, the kind that only long-time residers of the megacity of secrets could smell. At first regard, everything appeared calm. Business meetings progressed as usual, family gatherings maintained their polite grins, and familiar faces crossed paths with rehearsed civility. Yet beneath the face, feelings churned, provocations evolved, and old injuries restarted in ways that hovered to reshape connections that had formerly sounded unbreakable. At the center of this growing storm stood Hope Logan, a woman long defined by compassion, restraint, and moral certainty, now still stepping into strange home. For the first time in her life, Hope was no longer happy to simply reply to the chaos around her. Rather, she was preparing to orchestrate it. Hope's metamorphosis didn't be overnight. It was born from months of emotional strain, quiet bummers, and the exhausting burden of being everyone's moral compass. For times, she had tried to do everything right, choosing remission over resentment, tolerance over battle, and understanding over judgment. Yet time and again, those choices left her standing alone, watching others rewrite history while she carried the emotional consequences. Nearly along the way, Hope began to question whether virtuousness always had to mean tone immolation. That question dallied in her mind as she observed the complicated dynamic between Taylor Hayes and the man whose presence continued to ripple through Hope's particular life in uncomfortable ways. Taylor, with her polished countenance and professional sapience, had lately returned to familiar home, both geographically and emotionally. Her re-entry into the social and domestic circles of Los Angeles brought with it a sense of nostalgia and undetermined pressure. To numerous, Taylor represented stability, wisdom, and emotional maturity. But to Hope, Taylor had begun to emblematize commodity additional, entirely a recreating pattern of intrusion, a memorial that certain people always sounded to reclaim space that others were still fighting to cover. Though Hope admired Taylor on an intellectual position, emotionally she felt crowded, displaced, and decreasingly hovered by the ease with which Taylor slid back into places that Hope believed had long been settled. What worried Hope most wasn't simply Taylor's presence, but the way others responded to it. There was a familiarity, an emotional openness, and an implied comfort that followed Taylor wherever she went. Hope noticed how exchanges softened around her, how undetermined histories resurfaced without resistance, and how certain emotional doors appeared to renew without warning. For Hope, this stirred a deep sense of apprehension. It wasn't covetousness in the traditional sense, but commodity far more complex, a fear of being cancelled, of being overlooked in favor of a history that refused to stay buried. As these feelings boosted, Hope set up herself reflecting on her own part within the involved web of connections that defined her world. She realized that she had spent times being careful not to disrupt balance, frequently at her own expenditure. That consummation planted a dangerous seed. What if, just formerly, she allowed herself to control the narrative rather of being shaped by it? What if she tested the emotional boundaries others took for granted? These questions led Hope down a path she no way imagined she'd walk. A path where intention and manipulation blurred, and moral certainty came negotiable. The idea for the romantic trap surfaced gradationally, nearly innocently. It wasn't born from malignancy, but from curiosity and emotional fatigue. Hope wanted answers that words alone couldn't give. She wanted to see what Taylor truly wanted, how far she was willing to go, and whether the emotional signals Hope had tasted were real or imagined. More importantly, Hope wanted clarity for herself. She believed that setting the stage for a controlled emotional hassle might reveal trueness that everyone had been too polite, or too hysterical, to defy directly. The setting was chosen with scrupulous care. Hope understood the power of atmosphere, the way a familiar terrain could lower defenses and invite honesty. Everything about the plan was designed to feel organic rather than simulated, intimate rather than suspicious. From the timing to the position, Hope assured that every detail aligned with Taylor's emotional comfort zone. There was nothing overtly deceptive about the assignation itself, only the intention behind it marked the difference between coexistence and computation. As the plan unfolded, Hope maintained her composed surface, masking the internal conflict that hovered to overwhelm her. She was acutely apprehensive of the line she was crossing. This wasn't the Hope Logan people had come to anticipate. This interpretation of Hope was strategic, observant, and willing to risk emotional fallout for the sake of verity. Each step forward felt both empowering and frightening, as though she were slipping an old identity while stepping into a darker, more uncertain one. Taylor, ignorant of the emotional chessboard she was walking onto, approached the situation with openness and trust. Her instincts told her nothing was amiss. From her perspective, this was simply another moment of connection, another occasion to strengthen bonds and bring harmony to complicated connections. That supposition made the trap all the more effective, and all the more dangerous. Hope counted on Taylor's sincerity, knowing that it would naturally guide her toward emotional vulnerability. As the hassle progressed, subtle cues began to surface, moping moments, emotional openness, and responses that spoke louder than words ever could. Hope observed everything precisely, assaying expressions and emotional shifts with clinical perfection. What she discovered both validated her fears and strengthened her internal conflict. There was commodity incontrovertibly undetermined beneath Taylor's calm address, commodity that suggested feelings long allowed, dormant were veritably important alive. The consummation hit Hope harder than she anticipated. Rather of satisfaction, she felt a surge of remorse. Seeing the emotional reality play out forced Hope to defy the consequences of her conduct. The trap had worked, but at a cost. She had verified her reservations, yet in doing so, she had compromised her own sense of integrity. The knowledge she gained offered clarity, but it also left her questioning whether clarity was worth the emotional damage it caused. As the situation reached its emotional peak, Hope set up herself at a crossroads. She could allow the moment to continue unfolding, potentially exposing deeper trueness and risking unrecoverable consequences, or she could intermediate, conserving what little emotional safety remained. That internal struggle defined the moment, revealing how far Hope had come and how far she still had to go. The fate of the trap gurgled outward, subtly but forcefully. Indeed, without overt battle, the emotional shift was inarguable. Taylor tasted it, though she couldn't incontinently name it. Commodity had changed, commodity fragile had been disturbed. For Hope, the experience marked a turning point. She could no longer pretend to be untouched by the games others played, nor could she completely embrace the part of manipulator without defying its emotional risk. In the days that followed, Hope grappled with the weight of her decision. She had gained sapience, but lost a piece of her emotional innocence. The lines between right and wrong, tone protection and manipulation, had blurred beyond recognition. And as Los Angeles continued its meter of glamour and secretiveness, Hope Logan stood still at the center of a storm she had helped produce, knowing that the consequences of her conduct were only beginning to face. Because in a world where love, fidelity, and power constantly collide, indeed the most precisely set trap can end oil the bone. Who said it? And for Hope, the question was no longer whether she could control the narrative, but whether she could live with the interpretation of herself that surfaced from doing so. The emotional consequences of Hope's precisely orchestrated plan didn't fade with time. Rather, they settled into the lives of everyone involved like an implied pressure that refused to be ignored. Los Angeles had always been a megacity where secrets thrived beneath polished grins. But this particular secret carried a heavier weight. Hope moved through her days with a new mindfulness, seeing that commodity unrecoverable had shifted within her. The ease with which she formerly navigated her connections was gone, replaced by conservative observation and quiet tone evaluation. Every familiar setting now felt slightly altered, as if the megacity itself honored the change she had initiated. Taylor, meanwhile, set up herself unsettled in ways she couldn't incontinently articulate. She flattered herself on emotional intelligence, on her capability to understand provocations and patterns, yet this situation left her disoriented. There was a moping sense that she had been gently but designedly steered toward an emotional cliff. While no overt battle had passed, Taylor's instincts told her that the hassle wasn't as innocent as it appeared. This consummation eroded at her professional confidence and particular countenance, forcing her to review the hypotheticals she made about trust and intention. As days passed, Taylor began replaying moments in her mind, checking expressions and emotional beats she had preliminarily dismissed as inconsequential. What troubled her most was the feeling of vulnerability she had allowed herself to witness. For someone who spent her life helping others navigate emotional landmines, facing her own vulnerability was deeply unsettling. It raised uncomfortable questions about whether she had undervalued the emotional swings girding her, and whether she had misgauged Hope entirely. Hope's internal struggle boosted as she observed the subtle shift in Taylor's address. There was a heedfulness now, a faint emotional distance that Hope honored each too well because she had felt it herself in the history. Seeing that response forced Hope to defy the reality of her conduct. She hadn't simply sought clarity. She had disintegrated emotional equilibrium. The consummation sparked guilt, but it also awakened a new understanding of power. For the first time, Hope comprehended how fluently influence could be applied when one understood the emotional vulnerabilities of others. That understanding both frightened and inspired her. At the same time, Hope's particular life began reflecting the internal changes she could no longer deny. Her relations grew more measured, her emotional responses more subdued. Musketeers and family tasted the shift but plotted to pinpoint its cause. Hope had always been transparent, emotionally available and sincere. Now there was a subcast of heedfulness that suggested she was learning to cover herself maybe too well. This elaboration unsettled those who reckoned on her thickness, subtly altering dynamics across her social circle. The ripple goods extended beyond Hope and Taylor, touching others who tasted the emotional shift without completely understanding its origin. Old dynamics resurfaced, undetermined histories recaptured applicability, and long-standing emotional boundaries blurred. In a world where connections were formerly complicated by participated histories, this new subcast of query added energy to smoldering pressures. Everyone felt it, indeed if no bone spoke about it openly. Taylor's professional instincts ultimately impelled her to examine the situation through a remedial lens. She honored that emotional traps infrequently surface from atrocity alone. More frequently, they were born from undetermined pain. This consummation softened her perspective toward Hope, indeed as it complicated her passions. Taylor began to understand that Hope's conduct weren't simply manipulative, but reactive, a response to feeling marginalized and emotionally hovered. That understanding didn't excuse the jest, but it reframed it in a way that made conciliation possible, if not ineluctable. Yet conciliation, Taylor knew, would not come fluently. Trust, formerly shaken, needed deliberate trouble to rebuild. And while Taylor valued mending, she also admired emotional boundaries. The challenge lay in determining whether defying the situation would lead to resolution, or simply renew injuries that neither woman was prepared to face. That query kept Taylor in a state of emotional limbo, torn between her instinct to address issues head-on and her desire to save stability. Hope, for her part, continued scuffling with the duality of her feelings. On one hand, she felt empowered by the clarity she had gained. On the other, she mourned the loss of her moral certainty. The woman she had been, the bone, who believed that honesty and tolerance would always prevail, felt distant, nearly naive. In her place stood someone more realistic, more strategic, and incontrovertibly more equivocal. Hope wondered whether this metamorphosis was temporary, or the morning of an endless shift in her identity. As weeks turned into months, the romantic trap came lower about the moment itself and further about what it revealed. It exposed the fragility of emotional hypotheticals, the ease with which trust could be manipulated, and the retired costs of emotional tone defense. Hope realized that by setting the trap, she had crossed a line she could no way completely uncross. Indeed, if she chose a different path moving forward, the knowledge of what she was able of would remain with her. The implied pressure between Hope and Taylor ultimately came insolvable to ignore. Their relations grew decreasingly formal, stripped of the warmth that formerly defined them. Every participated space felt charged with undetermined emotion, each polite exchange concentrated with implied questions. Others noticed the shift, assuming still but lacking the full environment to understand its significance. The absence of open conflict only heightened the sense of apprehension, making the silence more important than any argument could have been. Behind unrestricted doors, Hope contemplated whether honesty might offer redemption. She considered revealing her intentions, admitting the manipulation, and accepting whatever consequences followed. Yet fear held her back, fear of judgment, of rejection, and of attesting the worst hypotheticals others might make about her. Admitting the verity would mean relinquishing control, commodity she had only just learned to apply. The internal debate consumed her, leaving her emotionally exhausted and decreasingly insulated. Taylor, seeing that avoidance was no longer sustainable, began preparing herself emotionally for a battle that had yet to materialize. She understood that mending needed acknowledgement, and she suspected that Hope was floundering just as deeply as she was. This recognition stirred empathy but also advice. Taylor knew that approaching the situation with compassion alone would not resolve the underpinning issues. Boundaries would need to be established, prospects clarified, and emotional honesty prioritized, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. The eventual reckoning, when it came, would not be explosive or dramatic in the traditional sense. Rather, it would be defined by quiet intensity, emotional vulnerability, and the weight of trueness long suppressed. Both women would be forced to defy not only each other, but also the performances of themselves they had been trying to cover. For Hope, that meant admitting her capacity for manipulation. For Taylor, it meant accepting her own emotional eyeless spots. In the larger shade of their participated world, this moment represented further than a particular conflict. It represented the evolving nature of connections in a place where history no way truly stayed in the history. The romantic trap wasn't an insulated incident, but a reflection of deeper emotional fractures that had been ignored for too long. And as those fractures widened, the eventuality for farther fallout grew decreasingly likely. What remained uncertain was whether Hope and Taylor would crop from this experience stronger or irrevocably changed. Redemption and remorse walked hand in hand, their issues dependent on choices yet to be made. In a megacity erected on reinvention, both women stood at the threshold of metamorphosis, apprehensive that the coming way they took would define not only their relationship, but their sense of tone. Because in the world of the bold and the beautiful, love was no way simple, intentions were infrequently pure, and indeed the most precisely laid plans carried consequences that no one could completely prognosticate. And as Hope Logan learned each too well, occasionally the most dangerous traps were the bones we set within ourselves. Time had a way of meaning trueness that words avoided, and in the weeks following Hope's precisely designed emotional trap, the verity began to surface in quiet, grim ways. What had originally felt like a contained moment now stretched outward, impacting opinions, altering commitment, and awakening precariousness that had been dormant for times. The emotional foreshocks were no longer subtle. They had come a constant turnabout in the lives of everyone connected to Hope and Taylor, shaping relations in ways that felt both ineluctable and deeply unsettling. Hope set up herself standing at an emotional crossroads she no way anticipated to reach. The clarity she formerly believed she demanded now felt like a burden rather than a gift. Knowing what she knew forced her to defy realities she had long tried to ignore. She could no longer pretend that connections was in neat orders of once and present, resolved and undetermined. The emotional complexity she uncovered was messy, layered, and resistant to simple results. Worse still, Hope realized that she was no longer an innocent bystander of this complexity. She had become an active party in its unraveling. As the days unfolded, Hope noticed subtle changes in how others responded to her. Nothing overt, nothing combative, but enough to confirm her growing dubitation. That emotional suspicion frequently anteceded conscious mindfulness. People tasted the shift in her energy. The warmth she formerly radiated so painlessly now carried an edge, a calculated restraint that made others conservative. Hope hadn't intended to change how she was perceived, yet the metamorphosis was inarguable. Power, she learned, always left a trace. Taylor's internal reckoning took a different shape. Oriented to guiding others through emotional warrens, she now set up herself navigating one without a chart. Her professional instincts disaccorded with her particular feelings, creating a pressure that refused to resolve still. She honored patterns she had seen innumerous times in others: avoidance, emotional protuberance, and the subtle pull of undetermined attachment. The unsettling part was realizing that she wasn't vulnerable to those patterns herself. What troubled Taylor most was the recognition that she had allowed familiarity to stamp caution. She had trusted emotional history to guide her, assuming that participated once jests automatically assured safety in the present. That supposition now felt dangerously naive. The consummation forced her to reassess not only Hope's conduct, but her own emotional boundaries. She questioned whether she had unconsciously invited complexity by failing to admit the emotional signals she herself was transferring. As Taylor reflected, she came decreasingly apprehensive of the broader counteraccusations of the situation. This was no longer just about one orchestrated moment or one misgauged commerce. It was about the undetermined emotional ecosystem that girdled them all. A network of participated histories, moping attachments, and emotional debts that had no way been completely settled. Hope's trap had simply illuminated what was formerly there, exposing fault lines that had been ignored in the name of stability.